So when you think about, okay, I've crossed, got my catheter down, I'm looking, okay, I've got some length, I've got some arc. Are you an OCT guy or are you an IVUS guy? What do you like to use?
Honestly, predominantly IVUS. I would say
Mhm.
90% plus IVUS, maybe 95% plus. I think, both obviously, all of the data will show that the importance is imaging rather than which modality you use. And, we actually published this in a network meta-analysis in the Lancet with Ziad and Greg Stone last year or the year before, that imaging reduces now all-cause death in randomized trials compared to angio. And if we structured that study as a network meta-analysis. So we tried to look at IVUS and OCT even in indirect comparisons, and there wasn't a major difference. So I would say that, it's up to whatever you're comfortable with. Dimitri was it was almost 100% IVUS. And so then I got...
EVUS.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
EVUS.
And so
EVUS.
I just have my eyes were just trained that way from just doing a gajillion cases with IVUS. And so now that for me is second nature. We're a training program, so we try to make sure that the trainees get exposed to both so that they graduate comfortable with both. But for me, predominantly, it's, more or less exclusively IVUS. The other thing is with, CTOs, and you don't know when you've crossed intraplaque and extraplaque, or you've crossed extraplaque and you don't want to pressurize that lumen until after stenting, then IVUS obviously I think has an advantage. And although there are technologies now coming out that make the contrast less of an issue, and that randomized trials show that extra contrast use isn't huge, again, if you have patients with very advanced renal dysfunction, with the current kind of technology that we have default in most cath labs in the US, then I think that's also a consideration. So for me, it's predominantly the IVUS.
Yeah, I think because my practice has been so CTO-centric for the entirety of my career, I sort of just always used IVUS, right? And so OCT was great for research. Man, when we were doing Disrupt CAD, being able to actually see the cracks, like really see them, was like wild. Because we're using this brand new tech. We don't know how it works or what's going on. We just see the balloon kind of pop. And we're like, is this... Actually seeing everything was wild. Now, with Illumia and some other stuff, was it really adding much? But to your point, it's MSA, do we have large dissections or plaque burdens at either end? I think IVUS is, for the third of interventional cardiologists that use imaging, it's like 90, I forget the market share, I think it's 93 or 94%, IVUS. And so I think while OCT provides this amazing detail that from a mechanism of action standpoint for therapeutics is like just key, routine practice, that's what it is, is really IVUS. And so I think once, let's say you've run your IVUS catheter down, calcified lesion, you're like, all right, I don't have to use atherectomy here because, I got my thing down, I'm going to be all right. Are there characteristics where you might say, and you kind of mentioned this earlier, but I just want to sort of crystallize it a bit. Are there characteristics where you might say, might use a specialty balloon versus IVL here?
So if I'm honest, my personal practice, I would say before Shortcut, which, I participated in and we can talk about, was honestly not to really use specialty balloons in calcium, more or less. So my general philosophy had been that once I get the imaging catheter down, if there is moderate calcium, then I will use a non-compliant balloon. So if if it's less than 360, or even if it's 360 and it's very focal, etc., then I'll use balloons. And if it's very severe calcium and it has those features that we talked about, the length, the arc is great, it's nodular, then I'll use, dedicated calcium modification tools like atherectomy and lithotripsy. So for me personally, specialty balloons had not really fit very largely into my calcium modification algorithm. I just couldn't find this kind of like Goldilocks sweet spot where it's like calcified enough is too bad for an NC balloon, but it's not bad enough to need atherectomy or lithotripsy. And so I, generally speaking, had not been a big user of specialty balloons for calcified lesions.
Yeah, it's been interesting. We used to use all this stuff all the time because we didn't have anything else, right? We'd use different sized burrs. All right, well, that didn't work. And we'd try and run these, I remember even back before Wolverine came out, there was an even worse deliverable, scoring balloon from Boston that, it was just like running a train down. It was so bulky. It was like running a cipher stent from back in the day. And then IVL comes out and everybody's like, oh man, this is easier to deliver. So they start using it. Well, then my good friend runs the COPS trial. And so, interesting. All right. So I've had the pleasure of working in a lot of different environments, the coolest academic centers on the cutting edge to community practice, all different things. And at the time when COPS came out, I took it to my partners. I was like, all right, guys, director of the cath lab here. I got to be cost conscious. We got some new data. Maybe we need to. So we kind of went over the study and we're going through like, all right, you kind of got to downsize it by 0.5 millimeter, take it to high pressure. Everybody's like, well, what's the high pressure? And I was like, oh, it's like, 18, on average. And everybody just sat there. And I remember one of the older guys in the group, he was just like, no. I was like, what do you mean no? Which is nice, being the director of a group when one of your folks just says no. I was like, what? You can't say no. Like, what do you mean no? Like, what does that mean? And he's like, I'm not doing that. I was like, well, I know, but here's the data. Like, we should try this from a cost constraint. So, no. Cool. So the challenge is actually
Good
getting
conversation.
people. Yeah, no, it was really well, and that's his personality. But I saw my other partners around the room. They're like, and I was like, all right, they're not doing that either. Okay, so I think that's the challenge, and this was all. There's all these layers, right? It's not just that. It's that originally IVL wasn't paid for, so we did this stuff to like make things work, right? We'd like run a rotabur down to try and increase reimbursement for both the hospital and the physician in order to kind of shove IVL in there. Or we can use IVL here because we used an Impella device, right? And we have a higher payment DRG. So these days, since that's kind of been taken off the table, I think some of those old patterns are still kind of there, like I'll use, and this was back when IVL wasn't paid for. I got to use an NC balloon. I got to make sure it doesn't expand. I've got to maybe use something else in order to justify. And now that it's, reimbursement's less of an issue and you actually get paid for the balloon as opposed to other technologies, from a cost standpoint, it's not just neutral. It's actually somewhat beneficial for both the physician and the hospital in many scenarios. And so I think we've seen some of that older sort of thought process, I think, hangs in your mind from when you did what you needed to do in order to make things work. I think kind of hangs there. But I do think the idea of, well, I'm not sure, maybe it's on the borderline of those criteria. We talked about length, arc, and thickness, or maybe I'm using IVUS and thickness. I think with Boston's HD IVUS, you can get a gauge of that. Like you can see a big rind versus kind of a thin shell. But if you don't know, I think that NC first is totally reasonable. You just got to make sure you got full expansion at nominal pressure and multiple views, making sure that you don't have any scalloping, or under expansion seems really reasonable.